Today, I'm joined by Steve Goreham. Steve is a speaker, an author, researcher on environmental issues. He's policy advisor at the Heartland Institute. And Steve, if I say welcome to the program, welcome to the UK column, you are often described as a climate change denier. Do you think that's a fair statement or a fair term to use?
Hey, Mike, great to join you. Yeah, I don't think that's a fair term. Matter of fact, I think everyone believes that the climate changes. I've never met anyone who doesn't think the climate changes. So I don't deny climate change. The question is what is causing it. That, of course, is the issue. And I think the evidence shows that climate is dominated by natural factors, not man-made emissions.
It's interesting. We hear very little about any significant scientific research being done on solar system, on the sun, which has got, since that drives everything on this planet.
Yes.
We hear very little about serious scientific research on the influence of the sun and other galactic effects on climate.
Well, it's out there, but as you know, the overwhelming consensus in the media, at least, not in science, because there is no consensus in science, but the media is driving the narrative, of course, that your neighbor's SUV or a power plant or other things are causing the oceans to rise, causing storms to get stronger, causing droughts and floods. But those things really are not supported by the evidence. If you read an article in the press about the climate, it's probably wrong in a number of ways.
Reading your book, Green Breakdown, The Coming Renewable Energy Failure, and at the beginning of the book, you're talking about standards of living and the way that humanity is developed, not just in terms of standard of living, but also obviously the size of the population that's supported by the societies that we've built for ourselves in recent centuries. And you're making the point that the reason that we are able to support populations of the size that we have to the standard that we have is because of the abundant availability of inexpensive energy. Obviously, the whole climate change policy, as it's described by the United Nations and so on, is and by governments, in fact, is talking about effectively removing that abundance of inexpensive energy from us. So it seems to me the inevitable outcome of that is a falling in the standard of living.
It does appear that would be the case. Yeah, in the early parts of the book, I go through what I call the hydrocarbon revolution. Most people, we have a lot of discussion about the Industrial Revolution. But in the last 2+ centuries, the world has gone into a hydrocarbon revolution. Basically, the use of coal, oil, and natural gas for all of our energy. Global energy consumption is up by a factor of 30 since 1800. It used to be human and animal muscle power. Now it's still about 81% hydrocarbon fuels. And the hydrocarbon revolution went through three big changes, if you will. One was the use of coal, which really started in England in the 1700s to drive machinery. And then we learned to take oil and turn it into fuels like gasoline and like diesel fuel. And finally, electricity, which was driven by coal initially, and then today still mostly hydrocarbons. And those made tremendous changes. And if you look at the flourishing of humanity, it's very highly correlated to the use of these fuels. Today, our fuels our energy consumption's gone up by a factor of 30. We have much longer lifespans. We have lower infant mortality. We have higher levels of education. We have much higher gross domestic product. All those things are very highly correlated with the use of coal, oil, and natural gas. But as you say, the world has now embarked on an energy transition. I should say the wealthy nations of the world, especially the United States and Europe, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and some others, are pushing for a thing called net zero by 2050. The idea that we should get rid of all of our hydrocarbon fuels switch to wind, solar, and biofuels, and also capture or eliminate all of our carbon dioxide emissions and make this transition. But this is, as I talk about in Green Breakdown, this is really beyond a reach out goal. It's more like a wish and a prayer. This is not something that's going to happen. And over the next decade or two, it is going to break down. We're going to have a number of problems with the net zero transition. It's going to break down, and people are going to demand a return to sensible energy policy.
That would be encouraging if it were to happen. I mean, if we just look at the energy policy that we have in the UK at the moment, we are increasingly building offshore wind turbine
Yes.
generating plant. We're shutting down our nuclear capability. Germany's already done that completely, but although we have started building a new power station, it's not going to replace what we're in the process of decommissioning. We've closed our coal power plants completely now, so they are really there only for emergency use, and even then it takes them ages to start up, so they're not even practical in that sense. But if we take wind turbines and offshore wind in particular, I was reading in the last couple of weeks the fact that there are very few companies geared up on the planet to manufacture the cables necessary to bring that energy onshore, and that already new offshore wind turbine installations are having to wait probably around 10 years for those cables, or they've got a lead time of around 10 years for that. That situation isn't going to get any better in the coming. So it's increasingly difficult for me to see how we can replace our generating capacity. I mean, in the UK, we have a generating capacity of something like 80 gigawatts, and there doesn't seem to be any plan to actually replace that with so-called renewables in the time that's needed.
Well, you're right. There are a lot of issues, and Europe, as an outside outside observer, I should say, from the United States, I'm a little bit dismayed at what Europe has done over the last 20 years. And you've recently gone through an energy crisis, and you're still in some of the later stages of that. But these are because of green energy policies, in my opinion. Over the last 2 decades, as you say, Europe has closed more than 100 nuclear power plants, more than 20 in the United Kingdom, more than 20 in Germany. 23 of your nations have signed pledges saying that you would not burn coal anymore, that there's been some backtracking on that to try and keep the lights on. And you become very dependent on two sources. One is intermittent wind and solar, and the other is natural gas. And increasingly, the natural gas had been imported more and more. Where in the year 2000, Europe was producing more than half of its own natural gas. That has shrunk, and by 2021, 63% of your gas was imported. And then in the summer of 2021, kind of a strange thing happened. Matter of fact, most of the year of 2021, the wind didn't blow much in Europe. Often I put up a chart that shows the electricity from wind in the year 2021 for France, Germany, and the UK, which is the bulk of what Europe uses, and it was down 20 to 30% the electricity output from wind in 2021. And so what your continent did was burn natural gas more and more during the year to make up for the shortfall. And by the end of the year, your prices of gas had soared. In early 2021, the price of natural gas in Europe was about 13 to 20 euros per megawatt hour. But by December of 2021, it had soared to 80 euros per megawatt hour. And this is 2 months before the Ukraine invasion. A lot of people blame this on the Ukraine invasion. And after the invasion, prices went much, much higher, but they had risen quite a bit prior to that because of the wind shortfall. Prices currently are running about 45 euros per megawatt hour, I believe, up about a little over 2 times what they were. And then electricity soared in Europe as well, because you get much of your electricity from natural gas. That was up by a factor of 6 by December of 2021, again, 2 months prior to the Ukraine invasion. And over the last couple decades, Europe has decided to rely on imports of natural gas. There was a study done by the European Commission in 2018 that pointed out you had more than 40 regions of shale in Europe that contained oil and gas. There's a big one called the Finno-Scandian Shield that goes all the way across the north of Europe from the Baltic nations all the way to the United Kingdom, a big shale field that holds natural gas. But Europe decided to hydraulically fracture none of those fields. And so you became more and more dependent upon imports. And liquefied natural gas is very expensive. Europe pays right now about 4 times the price of gas that we pay in the United States. And if it wasn't for the U.S. shipping liquefied natural gas last winter and Qatar to Europe, you wouldn't have been able to keep the lights on with the cutoff of gas from Russia. So, I mean, you've kind of gotten yourself into a bind. And let me say a little more about the intermittency problem. By the way, just interrupt me if you want me to stop here, if you got something else to do. I know I'm kind of droning on. Utility managers know that you can't count on wind and solar to be reliable. You can only count on about 10% of the capacity of wind and solar to be there all the time when it gets very cold or when you have a heat wave and the wind doesn't blow. And so what happens is all these states and nations that are pushing to do more and more energy from wind and solar have to keep around traditional power plants. They have to keep natural gas. They have to keep nuclear in most cases. They have to keep coal. And they have to run those at much lower utilization levels. They run those down. They keep them on standby as they run more and more wind. But then when the wind and solar don't blow, then you have to turn up these plants. Germany, for example, had turned up 27 coal-fired power plants last year to keep the lights on there with the Ukraine situation and with the shortage of natural gas. And so what you end up doing is building twice as many facilities as you normally would. You're building all the new wind and solar, and you've got to keep around the coal and natural gas and nuclear facilities, and you have to run them on kind of a reserve. And so you're paying for all of this. And so electricity prices go way, way up, which is one of the first problems with this push for net zero.
You know, in the UK, the British government has been talking about for the last number of years requiring people to, certainly new build properties, new build residential homes will no longer be allowed to have natural gas heating. Because in the UK, particularly in the towns and cities, most people's heating systems, central heating systems, are powered by mains supplied natural gas.
Yes.
And so they want to see new homes being built with electrical heat pumps, which have got a dubious reputation in this country anyway. But because most people are using natural gas, the government is now talking about asking people to remove their boilers and replace them. Yeah. That has had quite a bit of pushback. And so the next idea, the next bright spark idea was to reduce the amount of natural gas in the pipes by replacing a proportion of the natural gas with hydrogen and with green hydrogen in particular. I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that, particularly because you know where is green hydrogen supposed to come from? It comes from using plant attached to wind turbines and other so-called renewable sources, but those, as you say, are intermittent. So how is this possibly going to work in the long term?
Yeah, so let me address the natural gas and the heat pumps first, then we can go on and talk about hydrogen. So about 80% of the homes in the UK have natural gas. About 90% in Netherlands. You are amongst the 2 nations in the world that use a very high proportion of natural gas. And you're right, as you know, the UK government has said, well, we not only want to build new homes with heat pumps, but we also want to replace them in existing homes. And there's a few problems with this. One is it's very expensive, about 15,000 pounds, as I understand, to replace a gas system or a fuel boiler with a heat pump. And it can be more. They've also talked about insulating buildings and homes as well to try and reduce energy usage. My wife and I have two homes. We have one in Chicago. We have one in Virginia Beach. Virginia Beach is about, on average, 10 degrees Celsius warmer than Chicago. We have gas in Chicago. We do have a heat pump in Virginia Beach. And it gets down to about 0 Celsius there a few days in the year. And the heat pump just can't keep up at 0 Celsius. We have to put on a little gas fireplace to keep the place warm, but it kind of poops out. So if you're in any northern parts of England and it gets cold, that heat pump's just not going to make it. So that's a big issue. But this idea of hydrogen is also. I just wrote an article that was published in a Daily Caller, and the title of the article is that world leaders ignore growing safety problems with green energy. And this push for hydrogen is very, very crazy in my mind. They want to route this to homes. Now, let me tell you a little bit about hydrogen. Hydrogen only exists in nature in compounds. It's very reactive. I think they're trying to get some from deep fissures in the earth where they think there might be some pure hydrogen, but everywhere else, it is in a compound because it reacts instantly with air. And it also will combust at very low levels of energy. If your readers ever want to see something ugly, or your viewers, go read about the hydrogen airships. From about 1905 to 1937, the world wanted to produce hydrogen-filled airships. Hydrogen's lighter than air, and it could give these things buoyancy. But they had about 24 explosions and fires, and hundreds of people were killed. These airships would just blow up and ignite. The last one was the Hindenburg in 1937, and then the world decided they weren't going to use hydrogen. Hydrogen is not only very reactive, it will self-ignite when there's a leak and you have an air situation, but it's also a very small molecule, so it leaks out very easily. And to use hydrogen, you have to pressurize it to about 700 atmospheres. That's 10,000 pounds per square inch. That's 300 times what's the pressure in your car tire. And so you're taking this gas, which if it leaks, will ignite, and you are pressurizing it to 700 atmospheres, which makes leaks very lightly. And then you want to put it in filling stations, and you want to put it through pipelines all over, and you want to put it into homes. I have a perfect example from my history. I had a home near Chicago, and it was hit by lightning. It's a natural gas home. This is about 20 years ago, and it blew out our microwave and our TV and a number of other things. And we didn't know it also put a hole in our gas line. We found out that our lightning arrestor system was actually tied to our gas line pipe, which it shouldn't have been. But it put a little hole in our gas line pipe, and a few days later, we smelled gas because we're leaking out of this hole. But if that had been hydrogen, that would have exploded, or it would have burned our house up. Hydrogen is very, very self-combusting. So, your people ought to be thinking about this twice. And there's a big push for hydrogen in the US and in Europe. I think it's just a very, very bad idea from a safety point of view.
I'd like to talk about electric vehicles for a second. I want to come on to nuclear in a minute, but electric vehicles for a second, first of all.
Sure.
And obviously, we are in the process in the UK and in other Western countries of removing internal combustion engines from the streets. We want to see those gone as far from government policy point of view. That seems to be the case. In London, we've seen the rollout of the ultra low emission zone, which has resulted in a whole host of cars having to be removed from the central London area and the London area. And while that process is going on, we've got more and more manufacturing of electric vehicles, but we're not seeing the equivalent ramping up of infrastructure to provide that electricity to charge those vehicles. We're not seeing that being installed in the kinds of numbers that it would need to be on the motorways, and we're not seeing it on the streets. And so my question is, just how serious are governments? Maybe that's not the right way to phrase it. Let's put it this way: how much of a fake narrative is it that people are being sold by governments that they are even going to be able to own a car in the future because the infrastructure isn't going to be there to support the number of cars that are already on the streets if they were converted to electric vehicles?
The whole EV thing is pretty amazing. First, I should mention electric vehicles are penetrating world markets. About 13% of the light vehicles sold last year were electrics globally, and it's higher this year. And about 2% of the cars on the road, we have 1.5 billion vehicles on the road today, and about 2% are electric. So they are penetrating world markets. But we do have this a tremendous push by governments, again, driven by what I call climatism. Climatism is an ideology. It's the fear of human-caused warming. We have a couple conservative candidates in the United States now using that term. That was actually in the title of my first two books, the term climatism. But the idea is that if we all drive electric cars, we can stop the oceans from rising, or we can make storms less severe if we get rid of these gasoline vehicles. That is not really correct or supported by any kind of rational science. And nevertheless, electrics do have some advantages. If you can charge at home in your garage, that can be cheaper than a public charger. Although electricity has gone up so much in Europe, there may be a little bit of an issue there. If you drive a short distance to work, you can bring it home at night and charge. So it can be very convenient for people. But unfortunately, our nations have decided we're going to force everybody to get an electric vehicle. We have actual mandates in the UK. I think it's something like 2035. No new EVs sold. States in the United States, California, Oregon, Washington, New York, Massachusetts, Maryland also have mandates. In the United States, we have our Environmental Protection Agency that has put in regulations on carbon dioxide emissions and on mileage that are going to force automakers to produce EVs. So the world has signed up for this, and they seem to be moving in that direction. But the problems are mounting. And we're finding problems with cold weather. EVs don't charge well in cold weather. I spoke at a conference and met a guy whose wife had a Tesla. They lived in Cleveland. It can get cold in Cleveland. It got down to about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I don't know what that is, about maybe 8 degrees, minus 8 Celsius. And literally her Tesla would not charge. They didn't have a heated garage and they couldn't charge it. Another problem is if you have an apartment, how do you charge your vehicle? You're going to run an extension cord over the sidewalk, or they're going to have to build these things, which don't break even. These chargers are expensive. Insurance is another big issue in the United Kingdom, especially. A lot of headlines about companies that are, or I was reading one article about a guy who searched around, and it costs him £5,000 a year now to insure his electric vehicle. Very, very expensive. So there are a lot of problems piling up with EVs, and as you say, public charging is a very, very big problem. There aren't enough chargers. They don't break even. I'm going to give you some U.S. numbers. I don't know what it's like in the U.K., but in the United States, to put in a gas pump costs about $20,000. If you put in a 50 kilowatt DC high-speed charger, it costs you $100,000, 5 times as much. You can serve a customer with a gas pump in about 6 minutes, but typically to charge an electric vehicle takes about 30 minutes. And so you can only serve 1/5 of the customers. So a gas pump has a 25-to-1 advantage in terms of capital cost and the amount of customers you can serve. Another issue is that a lot of these chargers are meant to be unattended. You just put it out there. Well, that's great, except you get to the winter and it's dark at 4 or 5 o'clock, and maybe my wife doesn't want to be in an unsupervised location trying to charge your car for 30 minutes. We have a bunch of problems with car hijackings in our cities in the U.S. now. It's just not a very safe situation. So there are a lot of problems, and then we got issues with whether the grid can handle it. But there's a lot of problems building up with electric vehicles. I'm not opposed to electric vehicles. If it suits your needs, that's great. But again, the idea that the governments ought to be forcing everybody to get electric vehicles, that is not necessarily a thing. And then the last thing you mentioned, you talked about are people going to be driving less? Yeah, not only a charger issue, but you have the price of the EV, which is quite a bit higher than a gasoline car typically. So what we are seeing where EVs are being pushed, I think we're seeing the amount of driving go down, the amount of cars being sold go down. And some people do want this to occur. They want less people to have less vehicles and less ability to drive. So again, a host of problems. People should have choice. They shouldn't be forced to buy EVs on the mistaken idea that we're going to control global temperatures by doing that.
And then we've got the question of what is the actual cost of the life of an EV compared to an internal combustion engine car. So they will say that an internal combustion engine car will produce X amount of greenhouse gas in its lifetime and so on. But what is the actual cost of production of batteries, which do need to be replaced after a while, of wind turbines, of all the stuff that we're talking about here, in terms of the environmental cost of the mining, the environmental cost of the production itself, and the environmental cost of the waste disposal at the end? Has anybody done any kind of work to actually work out whether an EV or a wind turbine is actually making the situation better or not? Even if you believe their scenario about global warming.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of that is hidden from people. You buy your EV and you're told it produces less greenhouse gases. It's very environmentally friendly, but you don't really get much of the story. The guy who wrote my foreword for Green Breakdown, energy expert by the name of Mark Mills with the Manhattan Institute, has pointed out that you really don't know whether your EV produces less greenhouse gases or not. Electric vehicles start off with a big disadvantage because the battery emits a lot of greenhouse gases to be produced. And it usually takes about 100,000 miles or maybe 150,000 kilometers, whatever that number is, to be able to break even. But even worse than that, there are a number of other big issues. And as you point out, metals and producing the battery is a big issue. The International Energy Agency says that electric vehicles use 6 times the special metals of a gasoline or a diesel car, a petrol car. And that includes graphite and copper and nickel, manganese, cobalt, and lithium. And these metals are typically not mined in Europe. They're not even mined in the US. They're mined in developing nations. And then the nation that does the most processing of metals is China. So a typical scenario, if you look at if you look at cobalt, for example, which is used in almost all EV batteries, the biggest producer of cobalt ore is the Democratic Republic of Congo. They produce about 30 or 35% of the world's cobalt, and cobalt ore, I should say. And it's well known that in the DRC, they're using child labor and they're using slave labor. Well, I shouldn't say slave, I should say forced labor. They're using child labor and forced labor to get that ore out of the hills. And then they ship it to China. And in China, they process it into cobalt metal. But there's huge, wide area pollution in China from this metal processing. There's a place called Rare Earth Lake in China where, as far as you can see in every direction, square miles and square miles and square miles, the land has been destroyed from metal tailings, from processing. And then that goes into a battery and it comes to the United Kingdom or the United States, and it goes into your Tesla or your other EV, and everybody says, wow, my EV is very environmentally friendly, no emissions. but they don't see what's going on with the social damage and the environmental damage across the world. And so I have some friends who flat out will not buy an EV because of what goes on in terms of mining and processing across the world. And they're really more informed than a lot of the people that are buying EVs today.
I just mentioned there's a think tank in the UK called the Global Warming Policy Foundation. They produced a report a couple
Yeah,
of years ago called Electrifying the UK, and they were looking at this issue.
yeah,
So they were saying, effectively that in order to replace just the UK's fleet of internal combustion engine cars, you would need 200% of the annual global production of cobalt, 75% of the annual global production of lithium carbonate, and 50% of the annual global production of copper just for the UK.
yeah.
And so then you're left wondering, the people that are choosing this as a policy must understand this situation. And again, it strikes me that there must be therefore a view in their minds that car ownership is simply something which is not going to be something that people are going to have in the future. So, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but you were talking about cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that going to China and so on.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, that's going on in DRC that most of the environmentalists don't seem to be very concerned about is the forced evictions, because entire communities are being moved in order to expand the mines there. So,
Okay.
I'm not saying anything positive from this from an environmental point of view, setting aside the global warming story. From just a purely pollution and environmental and a human point of view, I'm not seeing anything positive here.
Every energy source, every vehicle has environmental issues. We need to come to grips with those. But again, people are getting the wrong story about EVs in many ways. By the way, don't get me wrong. I am very much in favor of pollution reduction. The United States, Europe, the developed nations of the world have done a terrific job in reducing air and water pollution, and the developing nations are catching up. For example, in the 1950s, my grandfather had a coal furnace in his house in the basement. And in Chicago, after it snowed, in 4 or 5 days, there would be a black film of coal dust on all the snow. And literally, we had a thing people called spring cleaning, and most young folks don't know what that is. But every spring, people would wash all the inside of their walls to remove the coal dust. But our air is very much cleaner today. According to the EPA, our air pollutants are down more than 80% since 1970. The volatile organic compounds that come out of the tailpipe of your car are down 98% since 1970. So we've done a great job removing real pollutants. The thing that we've gotten off track, though, is calling carbon dioxide a pollutant. Carbon dioxide is an odorless, harmless, invisible gas, doesn't cause smoke or smog. Each one of us, as we burn sugars in our body, we produce CO2. And so we all exhale about 2 pounds a day. What is that? About 1.5 kilograms a day of carbon dioxide, something like that. There are real pollution problems we need to solve. One is wastewater. About 80% of the wastewater that the world uses or disposes of goes untreated into rivers, lakes, and streams. Not in Europe, not in the United States, but in many of the developing nations. About 7 years ago, there were Olympics in Brazil, and the swimmers didn't want to swim in the water down there. Brazil is just building their first water treatment plants. We also have issues with plastic in the oceans, somewhat overstated. There are about 100 million tons of plastic in the oceans. We're adding about 10 million a year. Most of that is coming from developing nations and from Asia. That we need biodegradable plastics to help solve that problem. But again, we're spending so much money and wasting so much time on carbon dioxide, which should not be called a pollutant.
It may all be relative, but the amount of pollutants being pumped into British rivers and off the coasts from water, wastewater and sewage, that is now causing significant problems here. So I don't think it's just a third world problem anymore, unfortunately. I wanted to come on to the topic of nuclear energy.
Yeah,
because going back to the beginning of your book that was talking about the rising in living standards as a result of abundant, inexpensive energy. It seems
yeah,
to me that a part of that equation is energy density. And of course, one of the features of
yes,
hydrocarbons is that it's a much more energy dense product than, for example, coal or wood. And so we see that
absolutely.
progression going through. And the most energy dense generating capacity we have at the moment is nuclear. Now, nuclear has a bad press because of the weaponization and because of the waste products. I'd be interested in your thoughts on nuclear and maybe if fusion is still some decades away, why, I wonder, are we not using thorium, which seems like a much cleaner way to do fission than we are at the moment?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about land area first, since you mentioned that, and I'll go on to nuclear. So, in my book, I discuss energy density and the land needed for energy sources. And I use work by a guy by the name of Vaclav Smil, who's a professor and scientist in Canada. He's written a whole book on the footprint needed to produce electrical power. And he basically says, the watts per square meter of land that it takes to produce this power. And he includes everything. He includes pipelines and waste pits and mines and all parts of things. He does an estimate, and he finds that. And I like to ask audiences again when I present. Okay, so if you have an energy source that produces 1 unit of electricity on 1 unit of land, and another one that produces 1 unit of electricity on 100 units of land, which is the more environmentally friendly source? And of course, the answer is obvious. It's the one that's the most energy dense, the smallest uses of land. Well, if you look at that, you find that if you set nuclear at 1 unit of electricity for 1 unit of land, then natural gas is about zero point 0.8 and coal is about 1.4. They're all about the same. But solar takes 100 units of land to, on average, produce the same electricity as a nuclear plant. A wind takes between 35 and over 800 units of land, depending on if you just count the roads and the concrete foot for the towers, or you include all of this cover. Fuels are the worst, like your Drex plant. It requires 1,500 units of land to produce 1 unit of electricity. Yet the world has marched off and said, well, we're going to use all these intermittent renewables that are not energy dense at all, and we'll try and produce our electricity. These things all would be considered very, very environmentally unfriendly if it weren't for climatism, the fear of man-made global warming. So regarding nuclear, as I talk about in Green Breakdown, again, there were quotes from the 1950s that said, electricity is going to be too cheap to meter because of nuclear. And other people said nuclear is going to be 50 or 100% of our electricity by the year 2000. And it grew for many, many years, but then we ran into 3 Mile Island and we ran into Chernobyl and Fukushima, and we had these problems with some core meltdowns. And all these regulations, many of them useful, but I think we've gone overboard a little bit, have been put on nuclear plants. And so they've gotten very, very expensive today. In 1990, the world was getting about 17% of its electricity from nuclear, and we had about 450 nuclear plants. Today we have 437, and it's fallen to about 10% of our electricity. And it's because nuclear has gotten very expensive. We just brought a big traditional nuclear plant online in Georgia. It costs $30 billion. I think you have one in the UK coming online about the same price. These things, we really need a cost breakthrough, a technology breakthrough to get nuclear back in the game again. It's much more expensive than natural gas. As you say, molten salt reactors like thorium may be a way to do that. These small modular reactors may be a way to. I've not really seen, if you add up all these small reactors can produce about 200 megawatts, about a tenth of what a traditional one does. And if you stack a whole bunch together, they don't seem to be a lot cheaper than traditional plants. So we'll just have to see. I think we really need to find a way to get that breakthrough and get the cost of nuclear back down. which is one of the less polluting sources of electricity.
A lot of people would find that a very tricky statement, that they're less polluting. I mean, why do you say that? How do you get around the complaints about waste products and the length of time that they are hazardous for?
Well, we have waste issues. Those would have to be put under the land. I think there are some people. I think the French now are using breeder reactors, and have been for a number of years, that reuse the waste as fuel again, which reduces the amount of waste. But the molten salt reactors would get away from the core overheating issue if the heating system fails. So we could get rid of that kind of a disaster scenario. But yeah, the waste would have to be handled. But hey, we have a whole bunch of people now running around saying, well, we're going to put carbon dioxide under the ocean or underground. Yeah. I think if we could do that, we could find a way to put nuclear fuel underground as well.
Okay, I'd like to come back to, because you've introduced this term climatism.
Yeah.
And I just want to, because this is a big part of this whole debate, and it seems to me that the debate has become it's become quite polarized in many ways, but the polarization is being driven by so-called influencers in a lot of ways. So I just want to read you a comment that was I saw on the internet with respect to your use of the term climatism. And the comment was, climatism, very clever, assign an ism to a branch of science so that the ignorant, superstitious masses will believe that climate change is a political position rather than an analysis based on a body of research. After all, there's a large percentage of our country that seems to base their decision-making on primitive emotions, and they are the easiest for the conservative elites to control via their media machine and big money religious organizations. The bogus science behind the deniers' claims, but also the massive money trail behind the effort to stifle discussion and action on climate change. So that was a comment. Obviously, the type of person that has come from. But what I wanted to have a quick discussion about was, because there's a whole industry almost on YouTube at the moment of people that are there to debunk people that are criticizing science or the types of research that are being done at the moment. And of course, what this comment seems to imply is that anybody that's critical of the mainstream narrative on climate change is somehow being funded by someone. But of course, this is exactly what mainstream science is doing. It is being funded by through the research grants and so on to do certain types of research. It's ignoring anybody that's asking questions about that research. It's then funding a whole bunch of propaganda outlets in the form of so-called YouTube influencers to try to convince people that climate change is what is being proposed by governments and so on. So my question is, what are your thoughts on this whole industry that has built up and the whole debate, in fact, and the way that the debate is being held? And do you think that we need to perhaps raise the standard of the discussion somehow?
First off, I'll give you a disclaimer. I'm not in the pay of any energy company. I don't accept money for the Climate Science Coalition of America. I sell books and I speak professionally to business organizations. That's where I earn my keep. I also never say that people are liars. I never say that anything of the sort. I think the people that believe in a theory of man-made warming are sincere. Al Gore has been an environmentalist since the 1970s, but the data just shows that he's wrong. I mean, I think that really is the case. Let me give you an example. And by the way, there are many, I would say probably the majority of scientists think that humans are causing dangerous warming, but they're very, very silent when crazy articles come out. They don't say, that article's just goofy. Let me give you an example. This summer, there was a bunch of headlines. July could be the hottest month in 120,000 years. That ran in Fortune. And The Guardian said, quoted the UN chief, the era of global boiling has arrived. But that is flat out wrong. Hottest month in 120,000 years. There are oceans of data to show that today's temperatures are not especially warm. We've had 1 degree Celsius of warming since 1880, a very, very small amount. And it was warmer 1,000 years ago during the medieval warm period when the Vikings settled southwest Greenland. The town where they settled, Havasi, used to have trees that were 20 meters high. There are nothing there but scrub grasses today, indicating that it was warmer 1,000 years ago today. We've had warmer periods 2,000, 4,000, 8,000 years ago than it is today. Today's temperatures are not especially warm. There's a dig going on in Norway right now, which has been in the headlines, under an ice field, and they find all these artifacts from people who lived there when there was no ice there. There's a glacier in Switzerland, the mid-Switzerland, if you've been there or your viewers have been there, called the Rhone Glacier. The Rhone Glacier is a wall-to-wall ice field between the mountains in mid-Switzerland. The Rhone River flows out of it, goes into France and down into the Mediterranean. And that glacier's been receding for more than a century, but every time it pulls back, they find things like wagon wheels under it, and they find horse bridles, and they find wood that was 4,000 years old. And one scientist has pointed out that for the most of the last 10,000 years, there was no ice in that valley. That glacier did not exist. So this headline, the hottest in 120,000 years, all these climate scientists know that that's wrong, and none of them speak out against it. There's another scientist, what was the guy's name? Just a minute here. A guy by the name of Patrick Brown. He wrote an article that made the New York Post, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, I can't give the whole truth about climate change. If I'm trying to put an article into Nature, he says, get an article accepted in a technical journal, and I don't put in the theory of man-made warming in there, they won't accept my article. So there are very, very slanted things going on all the time about this topic. And if you look at the actual data, storms are not getting stronger. The polar bears are doing fine. We're not seeing more droughts and floods. The oceans have been rising. They're rising about 8 inches per century. And by the way, they've been rising for the last 20,000 years, the oceans. So there's just all sorts of distortion on this topic.
So what do we do about it? How do we promote some useful discussion on it?
Well, the economics and the science are going to win out on this. It's very possible we could get cooling over the next 2 decades. We just have to see. It's very difficult to predict Earth's temperatures. We have had, as we've come out of the Little Ice Age 300 years ago, they used to have a thing in England called the Frost Fair, right at London. The Thames River would freeze solid every year, and they'd have a fair right out on the frozen Thames. They'd bring horses and wagons and build sheds out there. The Thames, though, hasn't frozen solid in more than a century. It's very possible we could go, and by the way, these temperature swings I'm talking about are long before we had power plants or SUVs. It's very likely we could go back into a cooling period over the next 20 or 30 years, and then the theory is going to be very difficult to support. As far as an energy transition, that is going to break down. We are going to get higher energy prices, as you have in Europe. We're going to get electricity blackouts, as we're having in the United States. We're going to get less freedom for people because they want to take away your petrol car and your gas stove or your gas furnace. And we're going to have transnational energy shocks like has happened in Europe. And we're going to get these in other places too as we push toward green energy. So this thing is going to break down. People are going to return they're going to demand what is sensible energy. And hopefully we'll get back to working on real pollution.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Well, look, we're just about out of time. Steve, how do people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, they can go to Amazon and get Green Breakdown. I would advise them to educate themselves. Green Breakdown is a complete discussion of the energy transition, home appliances, power plants, vehicles, heavy industry, airlines, shipping. Tell them what's going on and what the government leaders are trying to do and how it's going to break down. They can get that at Amazon. There are ebooks available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple. And educate themselves and challenge their political leaders. And by the way, this thing, we're already seeing it break down in the United Kingdom and in Germany. People don't want to put in heat pumps. And so there's a lot of pressure and a lot of pushback. Again, Natural gas is a great thing. If you put natural gas in versus wood or coal in a house, you reduce particulate levels by a factor of 1,000. It is the one fuel that has done the most to reduce air pollution over the last 30 years in all the developed nations of the world.
Steve Goreham, thank you very much for joining me today. That's been a fascinating conversation. I hope we can speak again at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Always at your service in the future.